Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76 together. We are decoding the deception together today. We're here in the book of Genesis, chapter 16, and we're going to be taking a look at what can only be called a sad and confusing chapter. It's a very interesting window into the reality of real people living in God's service. Real people aren't always perfect. They're never perfect, but sometimes they just do things that you scratch your head about. And on top of that, there is a lot of cultural context here that has to be considered. So this is about Sarai and Hagar, because it's still Abram and Sarai. Their names have not yet been changed. That happens in the next chapter. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to her, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. There's just a whole lot of strange here. There's no doubt about it. The thing I want to call your attention to first is what's here in verse 3. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, etc., took Hagar, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband. 10 years. 10 years is a really long time. 10 years is a really long time when you are waiting on a promise. And don't forget, context is always so important. Don't forget what happened in the last chapter. God came, reassured Abram, showed him the stars in the heavens. Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then there was that land grant ceremony that took place to assure Abram that the land would be his and that his descendants would come back in the fourth generation and inherit the land, take the land. It would be theirs. So it's easy for us to sit here and say, Abram had this great assurance from God. He saw the ceremony that God performed in front of him. God came and spoke to him, showed him the stars in the heavens, and said, "So shall your descendants be." But it had been a long time. It had been a long time. And time does strange things to us. Or we get inside our own heads. We start thinking about things and analyzing things. And I'm not saying that thinking and analyzing aren't good things. They are. But when we get inside our own heads and when our thinking starts to take us from the sure promises of God, which it often does, nothing good comes from that. I can get inside my own head in just a few moments. 10 years. 10 years of waiting. 10 years, and they weren't getting any younger. So we as we look at this, Here's the big point, I think. As we look at this, we don't just want to look at it and say, how could they, why didn't they, what can you imagine it, that kind of stuff. Rather, I want to look at this and say, what can I learn from it for me? Because I don't think that I somehow am on the same par with Abraham when it comes to faith. No, I don't think so. So if these kind of missteps can take place with the likes of Abram and Sarai, then what cautionary tale is that to me? Had I not best be on guard? As Paul says, let him who stands take heed, and let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So let's look at this to learn, not to critique. I will say things that may sound negative about the thinking of Abraham and Sarah. It's not for the sake of putting them down. It's just for the sake of understanding. So she'd borne him no children. Not being able to have children is a stigma. It's difficult now. Back then, it was a huge thing. It was a huge thing. And all of these promises were based on having a son, having an heir. A lot of pressure there. And in the thinking of the day, they didn't call it infertility. They were barren. It was the woman's fault. That was their understanding of things. In their thinking, the man planted a little baby inside the woman, and it grew there. So if the baby doesn't grow, then the ground's no good. Okay? It was always the woman's fault, culturally. And it was that way for a long, long, long time. So Sarah's getting inside her own head. And the other thing we run into here is this giving your servant to your husband. It was, if a woman was barren, there had to be things that were done in order to make sure that progeny, especially a male child, was provided. Looking at, which I have not, I'm reading the stuff from the scholars who dig into this stuff and research, and there were marriage contracts, there were things in codified law about this very thing. If she can't have kids, then it's up to her to provide a servant, a slave, a servant who could have children. And then depending on the culture, depending on the land, that servant could become an equal of the wife and maybe even a better, all kinds of things that could go on with that. And that varied from region to region. Point being, what Sarah comes up with here, she's not making this up out of whole cloth. This isn't like, oh, well, hey, I've got an idea. We can do this. This was common practice. Now, the problem with it is, the problem with it is, it doesn't lean fully into the promises God had made. But even with that, we can give a caveat. We can say there's a caveat here because maybe Sarah thought the promises for Abram, it's not necessarily for me, so we better do something about this. Another point. Polygamy. Do you notice that it never says anything about them having multiple wives? It doesn't put it down. It doesn't say it's a negative. The laws about marriage weren't established for some time. They would be written out by Moses, the guy who's writing this book, 600-700 years later, after this. What the Bible does about polygamy is it shows you the absolute mess it makes of things. And it still went on, unfortunately, in the time of the kings. David had multiple wives. Solomon certainly had multiple wives and concubines, and it might have cost Solomon his faith. Solomon went way off the deep end. It's debatable as to whether at the end of his life he was a believer. So, all kinds of stuff culturally wrapped up with this, but Bible doesn't say anything about the patriarchs having multiple wives and it being a bad thing. It does show you, think of with Jacob and his wives, it does show you what a mess it makes of things. And it's hard enough. Marriage is a blessing. It's a wonderful thing, but it's hard enough for two sinful people to live in unity together as one. Trying to do that with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 1,000 just isn't going to work well. So Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." Sarai understands it that it's from the Lord. The Lord wasn't allowing this to happen, so there must be another way to get the Lord's will done. Is this the best thinking? Probably not, but that's what they thought. "Go into my servant that I may obtain children by her." Notice that it's I shall obtain children by her. It was Sarah's idea, and I know I flip back and forth between saying Sarah and Sarai and Abram and Abraham, but it's just the way it is. They're referred to more often as Abraham and Sarah, so that's just where my brain goes. She said, go into my servant. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. There's a lot of places we can go with this. Abram went along with it. He was the head of the household. Ultimately, it's his responsibility. Abram could have said, no, we're going to stop and pray about this. Abram could have said, we're going to inquire of the Lord about this. Abram could have said, this isn't being faithful to the Lord. And who knows what all was in Abram's mind. But it's no small point that the next thing that's said is it's been 10 years. Been 10 years since Genesis 12, 1 through 3, with him being called and coming there, 10 years and no children. And now we get into just what an absolute dumpster fire this turns into. And in case I forget to mention it later, when adults mess up, when adults in our modern world commit adultery, when adults fail to be to each other as husband and wife what they ought to be, who suffers most? The children suffer most. And in almost all things, all the time, when things go off the rails and aren't as they ought to be, who suffers? The powerful or the weak? It's always the weak. It's always the weak. They suffer the most. Who's in power here? Who has the most power? Abram has the most power. He's the head of the house. He was the equivalent of a king of his household. And the ones who are going to suffer, what choice did Hagar have in any of this? We kind of forget that, don't we? What choice did Hagar have? Yeah, she didn't have a choice. She didn't have a choice. I'm not saying she was against it. It was a prestigious thing. She might not have been against it, but she was still a pawn on the chessboard of Abram and Sarah's world. She was just a pawn. And Abram went ahead and listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Roles have kind of switched now, haven't they? Sarai's a dead fruit tree out there in the yard, and here the young upstart beautiful, fertile fruit tree is going to have the son of the head of the house, the Lord of the house, Abram. So yeah, she's going to look down at Sarai, and I'm not excusing it, but that's what was going to happen. And this very thing is dealt with in law in different ancient texts, how this is supposed to be worked out, what the relationship was. And why do you think they codified it in law in these different cultures? You know why? Because this is a dumpster fire. This isn't going to go anywhere good. The one who was a slave is now the one who's having the child of the Lord of the household. Yeah, it's going to go nuts. There's going to be all kinds of contention and strife and jealousy and all those things, all those negative things that do what? They destroy relationships, they destroy families. Yep. In this, I'm sorry, and I try to look at this from an all-around perspective, but I am a guy, okay? Abram's got to feel like, I can't win for losing. This wasn't my idea. It's your idea. Now, who's in hot water because of this? He is. It's kind of absurd. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. You know what Abram could do at this point? Nothing. The only thing he could do was to say, you're right, honey. I don't have any idea what I was thinking. I'm sorry, and I'll never do it again. Go ahead and do whatever you want to fix this mess that I've made. You know why? Because you wanted a happy home. And I'm not saying he had no blame in this mess, but at this point, there wasn't a whole lot he could do. He was just in a no-win situation. You could put this as the definition of no-win situation as illustrated in Scripture. But do you see what a mess this has just devolved into? The wheels are falling off. Everything's going wrong. It's just a mess. And why is it a mess? Because they took things into their own hands rather than trusting in the sure and certain promises of God as the head of the house. As the spiritual head of the household, as the Lord of the house, what should Abram have said? At the very least, we're going to stop and inquire of the Lord about this. Even better, God has promised that this child is going to come. We're going to trust him for it. We're not going to rely on the pagan practices of the people around us. We're different from them. We've been called out from Ur of the Chaldeans, where this kind of wacky, pagan, perverted stuff went down. We were called out for a reason, but it had been 10 years, and Abram was inside of his head, and Sarai was inside of her head. And Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Who was going to get it? Hagar was going to get it. And later on, Hagar's going to get it again. And Ishmael, the child who's going to be born, is going to get it again. It's always the weak who suffer. And what a cop-out on Abraham's part. And I said, there's nothing at this point he can do. He feels like there's no... If you're in charge, you're always in charge. If you are the one who has the responsibility of making sure that things are right, you always have the responsibility to carry that out. And what did he do? He handed that authority over to Sarai, who was angry, who had been slighted. And again, Hagar shouldn't have acted the way she did, but culture of the day, she thought she'd come up in the world. Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. That's not a good thing to say to a woman who feels wronged. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And this phrase, dealt harshly, it's pretty loaded. It can be physical, what we would call physical, mental abuse. Who knows what? Okay. Wouldn't think it would be too bad. It is Sarai, but what the customs of the day were and what was acceptable is a whole lot different than what you and I think of when we think of justice and what is acceptable practice. She dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Hagar says, I'm out of here. I'm taking off. I'm not sticking around. So if you think of that, she's a pregnant woman on the run in a fairly difficult environment. I want to tell you off the bat, if you're not using this service, if you have not used this service, you're missing it, because everyone has the same situation. You've got stacks of old photos in boxes. They're in photo albums. They have been left behind. Everything has gone digital. Well, we have a solution for that. Come out here to our website. The link is on the screen. It's in the description below. And our service is this. We will scan your photos, digitalize them at a very high level, send them back to you for 25 cents a piece. That's an amazing price. Even more, because you're a viewer of this video, use the coupon code decoding20 and you will get 20% off your order. So come out here, make use of this service. Scroll down, you'll see there's more. We enhance photos. We use artificial intelligence to digitally enhance those photos. We can do the same thing for digital images. So come out, check it out. You'll be supporting this channel, but you'll be getting something back, something that will last for generations, because you can take those pictures, share them with your entire family. It's the only way to do it. So come check it out. Interesting thing, we've got the angel of the Lord. We've had in the last chapter the word of the Lord. This is the angel of Yahweh. It is the first appearance of the angel of Yahweh. The angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. We'll talk about where that is in a moment. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Okay. We will go back up to the top. The angel of the Lord. Now, I said this is the first appearance of that title, the angel of the Lord. I'm not going to go into a big, long discourse on this. This is the pre-incarnate Christ. This is the visible Yahweh. The people of the Old Testament, the people of Israel, all the way right up until after the advent of Christ and his ministry is death is resurrection, believed that there were two powers in Yahweh. That's established beyond a doubt. What they got upset with Jesus about was he claimed to be this one, the angel of the Lord. He's called different things in different places. In the last chapter, he was referred to as the Word of the Lord. Okay? In Daniel 7, he's the Son of Man. Different titles, different names, different ways of describing him. This is God. This is God. How do we know? Now, I've got a note over here from a commentary. I'll just read it because I think it's worth looking at. Elsewhere, the Hebrew phrase used here, Malach Yahweh, is used in reference to Yahweh made visible or embodied, although it is not clear that the angel is always Yahweh. And that's my comment there. Nonsense. That's nonsense. What does this angel do? It's an important thing. What does this angel do? What does he say? From this here, the angel of Yahweh, all we can know is that it is an angel. But what does he do? What does he promise? Down here, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. You can tell it's God because God promises to do things only God can do. There are other places where angels appear and they talk about what God is going to do, what God has sent them to say, and the message that they are to deliver. Here, this angel claims to have the power to do things that only God can do. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Now, just that right there, we'll go ahead and jump into it. What does that sound like? A similar promise was made to someone else. Who was that? That's Abraham. Abram, your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Look at the stars. If you can number them, so will your offspring be. Ishmael is a descendant of Abraham. And what we're going to see consistently moving forward, because they come from Abraham, they're blessed. Doesn't matter how they came about. Doesn't matter whether God would have recommended this course of action to Abram and Sarai. Ishmael is Abram's son. Therefore, he will be blessed. He's going to, we're told a little farther down, and we'll get to it in a moment, he's going to, 12 nations are going to come from him. And that's made clear in Genesis 25 when Ishmael gets, guess what? A Toledoth all of his own. Remember that term, Toledoth, is these are the generations of. These are the generations of. There are 10 of them in the book of Genesis. They are the divisions of the book in Moses' mind, the author. Ishmael gets his own Toledoth, and he's just the son of Abram's concubine. God is going to bless Abraham. Let's just go back, because anytime you think about Abraham, this is what you need to think of. This is when God calls Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God's blessings are super abundant. They flow over like the water Jesus talked about at the well with the woman from Samaria. It just wells up and flows and goes all kinds of places, and it grants blessing and life and salvation and all those good things. But even Ishmael, who's going to be the father of a whole bunch of people who really end up not having anything much at all to do with Yahweh, still there's blessing. Why? Because it comes from the one who is the blessed one, Abraham. But here's poor Hagar. She's run away into the wilderness and she's found a spring on the way down to Shur. Let's take a look at where Shur is. Yeah, now I've got it on the wrong map. Well, even though it's not on here, I'll show you where it is. Shur, here's Beersheba, right? Shur's down here. It's down here. You keep going on down, back this map out. Where was she going? She was heading toward home. She was heading toward home. She was heading toward Egypt. She had nowhere else to go. So the Lord appears to her, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. That was the right thing to do. She was the property of Sarah. Now, probably have some people go off in the comments about how wicked and twisted and everything the God of the Old Testament is. And I see stuff like that sometimes. Slavery was the way things were. As faithfulness to God becomes all the more at the center of things and God's word has sway, guess what goes away more and more and more? Slavery. What can be said is that the Old Testament, the Torah, is the only text in the ancient world where slaves had rights, where there were laws pertaining to what you couldn't do to slaves. It wasn't God's mission to change everything about the world. It was God's mission to bring about salvation for the world. So she was Sarah's servant. She should go back. And plus, God had plans in mind for her. Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord says, I will multiply you. When we've talked about that, Ishmael ends up being a many mighty nations. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild. Let's just talk about that first. Ishmael means God hears. God hears. That's what Ishmael means. God heard Hagar's pleas for mercy. That's what Ishmael means. The Lord has listened to your affliction. And that right there, that God is on the side of the downtrodden, that God is about enforcing justice to the downtrodden, when he calls out wicked kings, when he calls out the wicked spiritual rulers of this world, the B'nai Elohim. Go read the charges against them in Psalm 82. They don't enforce justice. They don't do the things they're supposed to do. And that infuriates God. When God defines wickedness, when he defines it in the prophets against the way Israel and Judah have gone, he talks about them taking advantage of the poor and having no regard for them, and for there being no justice and no care and concern for the widow and the orphan and the homeless. Those are things that God cares about. Why? Because he is good and he is gracious and he is merciful. And he heard Hagar's affliction. But about Ishmael, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. The Ishmaelites were a problem for the Israelites. They were a problem for everybody. They were nomadic and they were warlike. It's just who they were. So this misstep on the part of Abram in Sarai ends up in what? Trouble that continues on as trouble. God didn't have to make it that way. Why did God make it that way? As a reminder. As a reminder. You know, Fleetwood Mac may have sung, "You Can Go Your Own Way." It doesn't work out well. It doesn't work out well. Problems come about as a result. So she, Hagar, called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." Or she said, "Truly, I have seen him who looks after me." Now, if she saw him, was he visible? And yes, that was a dumb question. It's obvious. He was visible. This wasn't a voice that came. He appeared. "Truly here, I have seen him who looks after me." And isn't that who our God is? He looks after us. He takes care of us. He takes care of us when we, do things that aren't that bright. He forgives us when we do things that aren't faithful. And another thought I had that I wanted to make sure and put out here, and I should have said it earlier. Thank God that you and all your family's foibles and shortcomings and missteps and ignorance aren't recorded in the most read book throughout all of history. Abram's are. The people of the scriptures are. And think of your own life. Think of your own missteps. Think of things that you have done that you hope no one ever knows about, that you and those closest to you don't even bring up. It's in the past, etc. We all have these things. We all have these things. But God looks after us. He looks over our shortcomings. You notice that what happens here in Genesis 16 doesn't negate what was laid out as promised to him in Genesis 12 or Genesis 15. And Genesis 17 is certainly going to make that abundantly clear. And yes, that is a teaser to go ahead and read Genesis 17 when we are done. "I have seen him who looks after me." God looks after us, and he loves us even though we're not that bright. He calls us sheep. And I really, honestly, I worked with sheep as a young man, and thinking of myself as a sheep just doesn't come easily. Sheep aren't very bright. Sheep aren't very brave. Sheep will do profoundly stupid things together as a group, and they're even worse on their own. I don't like to be thought of as a sheep. I prefer to be thought of as a ram. Rams are tough. They take care of themselves, and they're not that stupid. But God calls us sheep, and it's for a reason. We do stuff like this. We do stuff like this. But like the good shepherd that he is, he looks after us. He takes care of us. He fixes our mistakes. That is not license to perform those mistakes, to go ahead and say God's going to forgive it anyway, because right here we have another example of something. God forgives it. God overlooks it. God goes ahead and blesses them anyway, but the consequences, they bear those consequences. Ishmael was going to be a problem. He was going to be a problem when Isaac was born. He was going to be a problem throughout the history of that great nation that was going to come from Abram and Isaac. God looks after us, but he leaves the reminders of our shortcomings to help us think about things the right way so that we might learn and move on and advance. Therefore, the well was called Beer Lahai. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And again, these are places that people of the day knew. It's going down to where the Egyptians had at one time built a wall that was very well known. So familiar landmarks, just not to us. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Do you think that maybe Hagar told Abram something? Yeah, I think so. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. He was 75 years old when he was called. So now it had been 10 years. Now he's 86. We're up to 11 years of waiting. We're up to 11 years of waiting. But it is important to note that Abram's age is given at key events in his life. It was given there in Genesis 12. It's given here in Genesis 16. And here's the thing, just one to leave you with. By the time that Sarai becomes pregnant with Isaac, Ishmael's going to be 13. Going to be 13. Abram's going to be 99. There's a lot more waiting to come. We don't get to tell God what the timetable is supposed to be. Faith is a humble thing. And when I forget the humble part of it, when I lack humility and understanding who I am, how blessed I am, how God knows all things and I know very little, but what I know is enough. I know what he tells me. I know his promises, and I need to constantly be reminded of those promises. I need to lean into the word and get to know them all the better because they help me hold fast. They help me be humble. They help me be patient.